Success doesn't arrive overnight. It sneaks up on you the same way failure does, one small choice at a time. The question is, which direction is your snowball rolling today? Before we begin, I want you to imagine something simple, a small snowball sitting at the top of a hill. Not impressive, right? But gently push it, and with every turn, it gathers more snow, more weight, more momentum. In a few minutes, it becomes unstoppable. Your personal growth works the exact same way. The habits you repeat, the thoughts you entertain, the decisions you make quietly each day, they are all forming a snowball that will eventually shape your entire future. Most people never realize this until it's too late. But today, you're going to learn how to control that snowball, how to grow it in your favor, and how to turn small, ordinary actions into extraordinary lifelong results. If you stay with me till the end, you'll discover the precise shifts that create unstoppable momentum. Momentum that produces better health, better confidence, better relationships, and better success. Small actions repeated daily create massive long-term results, and this truth often hides in plain sight because the world is busy glorifying dramatic transformations instead of the quiet routines that build them. When people imagine success, they picture leaps, breakthroughs, or some kind of lightning strike that changes everything overnight. But if you study any life that has transformed for the better, you rarely find sudden explosions of progress. What you find instead are tiny behaviors that seemed insignificant at the time. Waking up 10 minutes earlier, reading a few pages, saving a small amount of money, practicing a skill for a short while, choosing kindness instead of anger, taking a walk instead of scrolling, or learning something new instead of complaining. Each action alone looks harmless, unimpressive, and easily dismissible. Yet it is precisely the simplicity that makes small actions so powerful. They quietly accumulate, stacking brick upon brick, until one day the foundation becomes unshakable. When you think about the human brain, you begin to understand that repetition is what rewires our thoughts, reshapes our beliefs, and strengthens our identities. A single act doesn't do that. A repeated act does. When you choose one small disciplined action every day, you're not just performing a behavior. You're casting a vote for the person you want to become. Over time, these votes add up, forming evidence, and that evidence builds confidence. Confidence then reinforces the behavior, creating a loop of growth. The beauty is that you don't need to take huge steps to create this loop. You just need consistency. Most people underestimate the power of small actions because they can't see immediate results. They overlook the fact that invisible progress is still progress. A seed stays underground long before it breaks the surface. Muscles strengthen before they visibly grow. Knowledge accumulates in the mind before it ever shows up in performance. You can be improving without noticing. That's how small actions work. They create change quietly before revealing it loudly. Another reason small actions are life-changing is sustainability. Big actions are dramatic but hard to maintain. Anyone can make a huge change once. Not everyone can repeat a small, meaningful action every day. But those who can are the ones who achieve extraordinary outcomes because they build habits that survive seasons, moods, and circumstances. A giant leap drains you, but a small step energizes you. A small action done daily becomes almost effortless, like brushing your teeth or locking your door. Once it becomes part of your identity, it requires little motivation. It becomes automatic. That's why people who rely on motivation burn out, while people who rely on habits rise consistently. Motivation is a spark. Habit is a system. Small actions transform into habits far more easily than large ones ever will. The compounding effect of small actions works in every area of life. Consider knowledge. If you read just 5 pages a day, that's over 1,500 pages a year. Several books finished without any pressure. If you save a small amount of money weekly, those savings grow not only from your contributions, but from interest, then interest on that interest. And the longer the timeline, the more dramatic the growth becomes. Relationships strengthen over small actions too. A thoughtful message, a sincere compliment, a moment of undivided attention. None of these seem life-changing in isolation, but they build trust, connection, and loyalty over time. Skills work the same way. 5 minutes of practice today and 5 minutes tomorrow compound, because your brain keeps reinforcing the neural pathways involved. This is why someone who starts small but stays consistent often surpasses the person who starts big but burns out quickly. Consistency also creates clarity. When you repeat an action regularly, you begin understanding which habits serve you, which ones need adjustment, and which ones should be removed. You gain insight through repetition. A person who journals a little each day becomes more aware of their thoughts and patterns than someone who writes only when life becomes overwhelming. A person who exercises a little each day understands their body better than someone who works out intensely every few months. Small actions give you frequent feedback, and feedback is the fuel of improvement. There's another subtle but powerful aspect to small actions: they reduce resistance. The human mind naturally avoids tasks that feel heavy or overwhelming, but it rarely resists something that feels light and manageable. Telling yourself to meditate for 2 minutes is easier than telling yourself to meditate for 30. Reading 2 pages is easier than committing to a full chapter. Writing 1 paragraph is easier than finishing a full article. But here's the magic. Once you start, you often do more than you intended. Small actions trick your brain into showing up, and showing up is half the victory. And even on the days when you do the bare minimum, you still keep the chain unbroken. You still maintain the identity of someone who practices, someone who grows, someone who tries. That identity, reinforced daily, is how transformation sticks. The influence of small actions also stretches beyond the action itself. When you do one small positive thing, you often follow it with another. You drink a glass of water, and suddenly you feel like walking for 10 minutes. You tidy one corner of your room, and suddenly you feel motivated to clear the whole space. You practice gratitude for 30 seconds, and suddenly the day feels lighter. These small wins create emotional momentum, and emotional momentum changes behavior far faster than pressure or self-criticism ever could. Most people never reach their potential because they wait for the perfect moment to take giant steps. But the perfect moment rarely arrives. Life is too unpredictable. Small actions don't require perfect conditions. They fit into messy schedules, busy days, and imperfect moods. This flexibility makes them far more powerful than rigid, overwhelming commitments. Growth is not about intensity. It is about continuity. Continuity makes change lasting. Intensity makes change temporary. When you embrace the philosophy of small, consistent actions, you no longer fear the journey. The mountain stops looking intimidating because you're no longer trying to climb it in a single day. You're just taking one steady step, then another, each one manageable, each one doable. And those steps eventually carve a path that becomes familiar, then comfortable, then unstoppable. When you choose small actions every day, something else happens. Your environment begins to shift. People notice your discipline. Opportunities gravitate toward consistency. You become more reliable in your own eyes, which builds self-trust, and self-trust is the foundation of all growth. You begin to expect more from yourself because you've given yourself proof that you follow through. And when you trust yourself, your goals no longer intimidate you. They excite you because you know you can move toward them daily without needing to rely on giant bursts of effort. This is the quiet power of small actions, repeated consistently. They accumulate, they compound, they expand, and eventually they transform everything. Momentum is your greatest ally because once progress begins to move in your favor, every step that follows becomes easier, more natural, and more automatic than the one before it. Momentum is the invisible force that takes the weight off your shoulders and begins to carry you forward, even on the days when motivation is low or circumstances are challenging. At the beginning of any journey, effort feels heavy because you are pushing against old habits, old patterns, and old versions of yourself. But once you cross that early resistance, everything starts to shift. What used to feel difficult becomes routine. What once required discipline becomes instinctive, and what once demanded mental energy becomes almost effortless. Momentum is the state in which your effort multiplies, and your results accelerate faster than the actions you are taking. It is the closest thing to a superpower that personal growth can offer, but it can only be earned through consistency, not shortcuts or dramatic bursts of effort. To understand momentum, imagine trying to move a heavy object. The hardest part is the first push. You lean in, strain your muscles, and exert far more energy than seems reasonable just to get it to budge an inch. But the moment it starts sliding, everything changes. The resistance decreases, your effort becomes smoother, and each push carries the object farther than the last. That first inch demanded the most strength, but the next inch demands less, and the inch after that becomes easier still. Human behavior follows the same pattern. Starting a new habit, breaking an old one, or pursuing a goal always feels hardest at the beginning because your mind is fighting inertia. Your natural tendency to stay the same. But once you break that inertia, momentum takes over. Momentum grows through repetition, even small repetition, because each action reinforces your identity, strengthens your belief, and increases your confidence. When you show up repeatedly, your brain begins to recognize the pattern. It becomes familiar, it becomes predictable, and eventually it becomes automatic. Once you reach that stage, you're no longer pushing against yourself. You're being carried by the force you've built. This is why people who build momentum experience rapid progress after a certain point. Their results begin to compound because the internal resistance that once slowed them down is gone. What remains is the pull of habit, the drive of identity, and the comfort of familiarity. Momentum also reduces decision fatigue. When you lack momentum, you have to negotiate with yourself constantly. Should I do it today or skip? Should I try or take the easy way out? Should I act or delay again? Each decision drains mental energy, and drained energy weakens discipline. But once you build momentum, the decision disappears because the action becomes part of your rhythm. You don't wake up asking if you should brush your teeth. You simply do it because momentum made it part of who you are. The same applies to fitness, learning discipline, or any area of growth. Once your behaviors ride the wave of momentum, you no longer rely on motivation. You rely on identity. Motivation flickers, but momentum sustains. Another powerful aspect of momentum is emotional momentum. When you complete one small positive action, it creates a feeling of capability, and that feeling leads you to take the next action. You make your bed, and you feel organized. That feeling leads you to clean your space. A clean space gives you clarity, which leads to better thinking, which leads to better decisions. One victory begets another. Each win, no matter how small, sends a message to your mind. I am capable. And when your mind believes you're capable, it becomes easier to take the next step. This emotional chain reaction is one of the most overlooked advantages of momentum. You're not just building habits, you're building feelings that support those habits. Momentum also protects you from setbacks. When you have strong momentum, a bad day doesn't derail you, a missed step doesn't discourage you, and obstacles don't intimidate you. Instead of losing progress, you simply slow down temporarily. A train moving at full speed doesn't stop instantly when it hits resistance. It pushes through. But a train barely moving can be stopped by the slightest obstacle. This is how life works. When your momentum is weak, small problems feel huge. When your momentum is strong, huge problems feel manageable. The difference isn't the size of the problem, it's the strength of your momentum. There is also the psychological momentum that comes from knowing you have a streak, a standard, or a track record worth protecting. When you've shown up for many days in a row, you don't want to break the chain. That desire becomes fuel. You begin to associate consistency with pride and identity. You prove to yourself that you can follow through, and that self-trust becomes an internal engine. It's much easier to continue something than to start something. Starting requires willpower, continuing requires momentum. A person who has done something for 30 days will guard it more fiercely than someone on day one because momentum creates emotional investment. Momentum influences your environment too. When you move consistently in a direction, people begin to recognize the pattern. Opportunities arise because they trust your reliability. Support appears because your actions inspire confidence. Life begins to open doors simply because you've been walking toward them long enough for them to become visible. When you move, the world moves with you. When you stall, the world stalls too. Momentum is not just internal, it is external. It shapes how others perceive you, what opportunities come your way, and how confidently you navigate challenges. Momentum encourages mastery. The more you repeat something, the deeper your understanding becomes. At first, your actions feel mechanical because you're still learning how to do them. But with momentum, you begin refining. You stop trying to survive the habit and start improving it. You look for small upgrades, small efficiencies, and small improvements that elevate your performance. This process converts beginners into experts, amateurs into professionals, and dreamers into achievers. Momentum doesn't just help you maintain a habit, it helps you evolve within the habit. One of the most underrated truths about momentum is that it creates joy. When you feel yourself improving regularly, even in small ways, life becomes lighter. Growth produces energy, and that energy produces motivation, and that motivation feeds back into more growth. You begin to look forward to the process because you enjoy the feeling of progress. Momentum transforms discipline from a burden into an appetite. You stop doing things because you have to, and begin doing them because you want to. That shift changes everything. It is one of the clearest signs that momentum has taken root. Momentum also builds resilience. When you have been consistent for a long time, setbacks no longer feel like failures. They feel like temporary interruptions. You don't interpret obstacles as signs to quit, but as challenges to adjust to. You stop expecting the journey to be easy and start expecting yourself to be strong. You develop the patience to endure and the clarity to continue. This resilience is not born from sudden effort, but from accumulated proof that you are capable of showing up again and again. Momentum removes doubt. The more you act, the less you fear. The less you fear, the more confidently you move. Doubt thrives in stillness, but weakens in motion. When you're moving forward every day, even slowly, your mind doesn't have the time or space to create fear-based narratives. You are too busy progressing to entertain limitations. This is why momentum often separates those who succeed from those who merely dream. The ones who succeed keep moving long enough for doubt to dissolve. When momentum becomes part of your life, it feels as if the world is cooperating with you. Tasks flow more smoothly, ideas come more easily, and decisions feel clearer because you have a rhythm that supports your goals. You begin to live with a sense of direction rather than drifting. You move with intention rather than hesitation. And as that rhythm strengthens, your life aligns with the person you're becoming, not the person you were. Momentum becomes the bridge that carries you from where you started to where you are destined to go. Neglect also compounds, and this truth is often more dangerous than people realize because negative habits rarely announce themselves with alarms or warnings. They grow quietly, softly, subtly, and by the time you notice the consequences, the damage has already taken root. Just as positive habits gain momentum when repeated daily, negative habits gain momentum too. The difference is that positive habits build your life, while negative habits slowly dismantle it. Most people underestimate how quickly a small act of neglect can expand into a pattern, and how easily that pattern can reshape their mindset, their behavior, and eventually their destiny. Neglect is sneaky. It never feels destructive in the beginning. It feels harmless, justified, or insignificant. But repeated enough times, it becomes a powerful force that drags you backward just as quickly as growth pushes you forward. Neglect starts with something as simple as saying, "I'll do it tomorrow." At first, tomorrow seems like a reasonable plan. But when tomorrow becomes the default answer, instead of a temporary solution, procrastination takes root. Each time you push something forward, you reinforce the habit of delay. And a delayed action doesn't remain neutral. It creates a small crack in your discipline. Over time, that crack widens. You start to trust yourself less because you've built a pattern of not following through. When you lose trust in yourself, your confidence weakens. When confidence weakens, hesitation grows. Soon, neglect isn't just about the task you postponed. It becomes part of your identity, shaping how you think and what you believe you're capable of. Neglect compounds in behaviors too. Skipping one workout doesn't make you unhealthy, but skipping 10 begins to create stiffness, low energy, and loss of momentum. Forgetting to practice gratitude once doesn't change your perspective, but forgetting it for weeks can make life feel heavier and more negative. Eating one unhealthy meal won't harm you, but making it a comfort for stress or boredom slowly erodes your well-being. Small decisions, repeated often enough, bend your life in a direction you didn't intend to go. And the unsettling part is that neglect often feels easier than effort. Growth requires intention, neglect requires nothing. It thrives in silence and routine, in the comfortable excuses that blend into everyday life. Neglect also expands through the mind. When you neglect positive thoughts, negative ones fill the space. If you stop feeding your mind with learning, inspiration, or clarity, it doesn't stay empty. It becomes occupied by worry, fear, doubt, or distraction. The mind doesn't remain neutral. It leans toward whatever you expose it to the most. If you neglect personal development, your thinking becomes reactive instead of proactive. You don't grow stronger emotionally, you grow more vulnerable to stress, confusion, and negativity. A neglected mind becomes cluttered, and a cluttered mind struggles to make clear decisions. That's how small mental neglect becomes large life complications. Relationships are deeply affected by compounded neglect as well. Forgetting to send appreciation once doesn't hurt anyone, but neglecting small gestures consistently dulls connection. Avoiding difficult conversations becomes a habit, and over time, distance forms. A lack of communication becomes normal, and suddenly two people who care deeply for each other now speak like strangers. Neglect turns into misunderstanding, misunderstanding turns into bitterness, and bitterness becomes a wall that's far harder to break down than it would have been to maintain the relationship with small acts of effort. Relationships don't fall apart because of one explosive event most of the time. They fall apart because of tiny moments of neglect repeated over months or years. Neglect also affects opportunities. When you neglect your skills, they deteriorate. When you neglect learning, you fall behind. When you neglect showing up consistently, opportunities pass you by. Life rewards those who stay ready, not those who get ready only when something appears. Neglect makes you unprepared, and being unprepared often means missing chances that could have changed everything. People blame bad luck when their real challenge was quiet neglect accumulating over time. Skills rust when left unused. Creativity weakens when left unexplored. Discipline fades when left unpracticed. The cost of neglect becomes visible only when an opportunity arrives and you're not able to seize it. Neglect compounds emotionally too. When you ignore stress, it grows. When you ignore your mental health, the weight increases. When you ignore unresolved issues, they intensify. Emotional neglect may feel invisible at first, but it slowly affects your energy, your clarity, your patience, and even your sense of self. A small problem left unattended becomes a heavy burden. What could have been solved with a conversation becomes an argument. What could have been eased with reflection becomes anxiety. Emotional neglect doesn't stay contained. It spreads into your behavior, your mood, and the way you show up in your daily life. Neglect compounds in self-discipline just as powerfully. Every day you allow yourself to skip a commitment, your internal standards drop a little. You become more comfortable with inconsistency, and inconsistency becomes easier to justify. The more you justify, the weaker your boundaries become. And once your boundaries weaken, your goals begin to drift out of alignment. Neglect slowly lowers the bar, and you begin to accept things from yourself that you once wouldn't. Over time, this shapes your character. Self-discipline isn't lost in one moment of weakness. It's lost in many small ones that accumulate quietly. Neglect is also powerful because it creates momentum in the wrong direction. The same principle that makes good habits easier over time also makes bad habits harder to stop. Once you start rolling downhill, you pick up speed. You don't lose one day, you lose the habit. You don't lose 1 hour, you lose the rhythm. And once momentum turns against you, it takes far more effort to reverse the direction than it would have taken to stay consistent. People often wonder why restarting is so difficult. It's because neglect didn't just pause your progress. It created a reverse snowball that grew larger each day you let it roll unchecked. Neglect influences your environment too. When you neglect your space, it becomes chaotic, and chaos affects your thoughts and productivity. When you neglect your finances, small expenses add up, debt grows, and financial stress multiplies. When you neglect your physical health, your energy declines, making even simple tasks feel draining. Neglect radiates outward because every area of life touches another. A neglected workspace affects your focus. A neglected body affects your confidence. A neglected mindset affects your decisions. Neglect spreads like ripples, turning small issues into larger ones. Neglect compounds because it leverages comfort. The comfortable choice is rarely the beneficial one, and neglect often disguises itself as comfort. Resting when you're tired is healthy. Resting because it's easier than acting becomes neglect. Taking a break to recharge is wise. Taking a break to avoid something becomes avoidance. The line between self-care and neglect is crossed quietly, and once you cross it, comfort begins to control your actions. Comfort is the enemy of growth because it makes you feel safe while slowly moving you backward. Neglect also shapes your future identity. Each time you neglect something important, you reinforce a version of yourself who settles. You teach yourself that your goals can wait, your dreams can wait, your responsibilities can wait. But dreams don't disappear. They simply drift farther away until they feel unreachable. When you consistently neglect something you once cared about, your identity shifts from someone who aspires to someone who merely wishes. Wishes don't create change. Intentional action does. And neglect is the opposite of intention. Neglect compounds in silence, but its consequences speak loudly. It is the quiet force that destroys potential not through dramatic events, but through repeated inaction. Once you understand how neglect grows, you realize the importance of staying intentional daily, not for perfection, but for direction, not for intensity, but for consistency, and not for immediate results, but for long-term alignment with the person you aspire to become.